Viking time! Let's talk a little bit about Vikings. This is a replica by Albion of the Clontarf Sword, a Viking era, 9th century kind of sword. So we're talking about here about the period of the Great Horde that invaded England in 865, and of course this came after decades of Scandinavian raiding on not just the British Isles but also on parts of what are now France, so Francia at the time, bits of Germany, and all over the place, basically Ireland. The Scandinavians, and let's call them Vikings from now on in this video, okay? So I have, you know, understandably and I think justifiably questioned the term Vikings. The word Viking itself has questionable etymology and origin. Generally speaking, in period sources, these people that we now refer to as the Vikings are referred to as either Danes or heathens or pagans or sometimes Norse, but they came from essentially most of the ones that came to Britain, and I'm going to be mostly talking about Britain and Ireland in this video. Most of them that came to Britain and Ireland were probably from Norway and Denmark, and with probably the vast majority in the earlier stages from Denmark, and in the maybe the middle stages perhaps from Norway. This is a theory, it's not necessarily correct. And then of course we know that people like Canute, who conquered England, Knut I believe it's pronounced in Danish rather than Canute as we say in England and America, and he of course was Danish, but you have to remember of course that Danish, Swedish, Norwegian wasn't necessarily a divide as we view it now. They weren't necessarily separate entities. So what nationality was Harald Hardrada? I don't really know, okay? I think he was probably Norwegian by modern standards, but anyway. But the main point of this video is morality, and now clearly morality is a flexible thing, but in recent years, let's say in the 20th century, and probably even this goes back to the Gothic revival of the 19th century, there's been a certain amount of romanticisation, well, that's a bit of a mouthful, of Vikings, rah! You know, big beardy hairy guys with horns on their helmets and mighty swords and mighty axes, raping and pillaging and stealing, and this appeals to a certain type of story, doesn't it? And that's really what it's about. It's about storytelling. There's a certain type of villain, of baddie, and you know, ironically, the villain. If we take a film of relatively modern times, if we take Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, who's our favourite character in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves? Probably the Sheriff of Nottingham. I think that a significant proportion of people who watch that movie, their favourite character is the Sheriff of Nottingham, played by the late great Alan Rickman, of course, and that's completely understandable because he's the most charismatic and interesting character in the story. If you were actually living in that world, if Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Kevin Costner world was a real place, thank the gods it's not, but if it was a real place, then clearly you wouldn't like the Sheriff of Nottingham. If you were one of the people who was living as an outlaw in the forest, or a peasant who was having all of the fruits of your labours being taken off you by this exploitative local sheriff official, government official, you wouldn't like him. But because we are viewers, because we're outside that story, we view it and we enjoy the villain, because the villain's charismatic, funny, interesting to watch. And yeah, okay, so there are characters in that story who are pure and who are good, and there's nothing negative told us about them in that story, and so they should be the ones that we like. But they're not. So for this kind of reason, this storytelling reason, the Vikings are often the ones that we kind of find the most interesting. You know, in more recent times, obviously, there's the books about Flashman by MacDonald Fraser, and you know, Flashman is a despicable character, but it's nevertheless quite fun to read about some of his exploits, even if he does terrible things, if he rapes and murders. He's a terrible person, but it's still fun to read about. Now, this is a challenge when we actually come to study the real history. I am holding a real history book here to show that I'm doing real history. Now, I'm going to read from it in a second. But this is a real challenge and a hurdle to get over when we come to the subject of studying the so-called Dark Ages or the early medieval period, because we actually have a relative lack of source material to work from. It's not to say we don't have sources, we have lots of sources, but they are fairly thin on the ground compared to later periods. So I now focus my researches on the 19th century, as all of my regular viewers know. But in my formative years at school and university, I was absolutely focused on the medieval period. I had to study, both at school and in my university degree, I had to study the early medieval period. Because that was what the majority of those courses I studied were based around. But my personal passion was the 14th and 15th centuries, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, this period, the sort of condottieri wars in Italy and this kind of stuff. But the early medieval period is very interesting, but you have to marry archaeology with history to come up with any kind of theories about it, because there isn't an awful lot of history to work from. And if we look at the quantity of sources, it kind of goes, you know, if 19th century is kind of my height, then 14th and 15th century is somewhere around my knee or shin, and the Viking era, say the 8th through to the 11th century, is somewhere just slightly up my ankle bone. Okay, it's a rather silly kind of visual example to make, but there really aren't a lot of sources to work from. If we look at something as historically important as the Battle of Hastings, we've only got really a handful, literally a handful, like 5 or 6 sources to work from. And of those, only sort of 2 or 3 of them are really, really useful and really, you know, have got much meat to them. So when we get back to the 9th century, you know, the period of well, the 9th and the 10th centuries being really big Viking activity, we don't have an awful lot to go from. But when we're talking about morality, there are certain things we can say. There are certain things we know that the so-called Vikings did do, okay? Now, in modern times, it has become very fashionable. As I've mentioned in previous videos, it's become very fashionable for archaeologists especially, and I suffered this to some degree during when I was studying archaeology. It's become very fashionable to focus on the peaceful and the harmonious aspects of human existence. But the fact is that war and exploitation and slavery and rape and murder are real things, and they have definitely been a part of British history and basically every human history. We have to accept that I don't know of any culture that has existed which hasn't had some form of slavery in it, or that hasn't had exploitation of people in it. Equally, in the early medieval period, we have to accept that slavery was what a lot of society in Europe was based on. So we can absolutely say that what the Vikings did do some settling and trading and, you know, building and the various things that were kind of peaceful to the modern mindset things, but they also did warlike things. But so did the other people at that time. So it's absolutely correct to point out that, you know, there were people of slave status living in the Frankish Empire. There were people of slave status living in Anglo-Saxon England. And indeed, what was a lot of Scandinavian or Viking trade built on? Slaves. So one of the main things they did in Ireland was they arrived in Ireland, killed a load of people, traded with some people, I'm sure, traded with some people, killed a lot of people, fought some people, and took a lot of people away. One of the interesting things there is, and I don't know if much has been done on this, there must be some degree of Irish blood, and English probably to a lesser degree, I don't know, but definitely Irish blood, in parts of Scandinavia where slaves were taken. Okay, and of course they weren't just taking slaves from Ireland, they were taking slaves from France, what became France, Francia, and England and elsewhere as well. But slavery goes both ways, because remember, of course, that there are several ways of gathering slaves. If you're a slaver, then there are numerous ways of getting slaves, and the two big ways of getting slaves are to either physically take them or to buy them. And this is something that's not necessarily widely accepted, or widely acknowledged rather. I think it's completely widely accepted, but not necessarily widely noted. And that is that the Irish and the English probably didn't only find themselves taken away by Viking slavers or raiders, but they probably, in some cases, were sold as well. So I'm absolutely certain that in some cases, prisoners of war, and remember that Ireland and England were divided up into little principalities who were at war with each other. And if we look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, in the lead up to the Viking invasions and after the Viking invasions, we see that Wessex and Mercia and East Anglia and Northumbria were at war with each other at various points, and undoubtedly therefore would have taken prisoners of war and slaves, and I'm certain sometimes sold slaves to the Scandinavians, to the Vikings. So absolutely, sometimes slaves were taken, sometimes slaves were sold. But getting back to my main point, I don't think we can ignore the fact that Vikings were, by their very nature, first and foremost, raiders. They were invaders. Okay, what was the Great Horde of 865? It was an invasion. Okay, and it was an invasion that involved not just soldiers, but later on it very definitely involved a migration of people as well, people who wanted to settle the land or take the land. And those people did, of course, do lots of killing and raping and pillaging. And the first, Lindisfarne, 793, the first recorded Viking attack on the British Isles was the slaughter of a bunch of monks. Now, in modern times, we might go, ha ha ha, oh, these crazy Viking raiders, probably having a bit of a party the night before, practicing some axe throwing, dancing on some oars on the side of their longboat, and then in the morning, with a bit of a hangover, they'll get their war face on and go, "Arr!" and they'll charge into the local monastery, and they'll kill some monks and maybe torture a couple and steal all the silver, and then they'll be gone again the day after that. But this is pretty freaking horrific. Now, when I point things out, or when anyone points out this kind of thing, people go, oh yes, but it's no worse than the Huns or the Avars were doing, or it's no worse than Charlemagne was doing to the Avars or the Saxons, or forcing them to convert at the point of a sword, or it's no worse than the Mercians and the West Saxons were doing to each other. Well, there's a little bit of a problem there. First of all, Christians by nature were an aggressive, conquering, converting religion. Okay, just the same as Islam was in that period. Islam was spread with the sword and with the book. It was spread in both ways, and so was Christianity. Or at least the early medieval history of Christianity and Islam share a lot of parallels. Okay, they were both spread in both ways. Many people converted because they wanted to convert, and many people were converted because they were forced to convert. Okay, that's just a historical fact. There's no political agenda or kind of slant there, I don't think. And Charlemagne absolutely, definitely did convert people at the point of the sword. And I'm pretty sure, well, we don't have very good sources for it, but it's pretty much a sure thing that this was done in Anglo-Saxon England as well. And of course, we know in some cases, Guthrum, for example, we don't really know if Guthrum, so he was one of the, initially one of the lesser leaders of the Great Horde of 865, but became one of the prominent leaders, fighting against Alfred, King Alfred of Wessex, and Guthrum was defeated and forced to convert. Well, he did convert to Christianity, and it's not really known. We don't really have enough source material, and we've only got it from the Anglo-Saxon side, of course. We don't really know whether he was forced to convert or whether he converted because he saw the light and didn't want to follow, Thor and Odin anymore, but decided that Jesus Christ was the way forward. We don't know, or whether he was just given a choice of basically, all your family will be killed slowly, or you could become a Christian and we'll, let you live peacefully. We don't know. But the fact is that yes, it was more brutal times, and yes, it was normal to take prisoners of war, and yes, it was usual to have people in society who had slave status, and yes, it was normal to sell slaves and capture slaves, and yes, it was normal to raid enemy lands and sometimes to kill civilians. Interesting to note, of course, that is officially forbidden in the Quran, but in Christian lands, as far as I know, there was nothing really discouraging anyone from just killing enemy populations, and definitely this was done. The Viking raids were something else, and I don't think, on one hand, we shouldn't necessarily be flippant about it. You know, monks were people, whatever your views of Catholicism or monks or whatever else. It was a pretty nasty thing that defenceless monks were slaughtered. And did that happen? Some people might go, oh, maybe it's just propaganda, it didn't happen. Well, why wouldn't it happen? If you were a marauding Viking, there is nothing in your morality preventing you from, if you want to steal their silver, well, you'll just kill them to, you know, so they're not in the way anymore. There's nothing bad about that in your culture or your religion or anything else. You don't have any moral ground telling you that, oh, well, you know, we're not going to hurt the monks, we just want to take their silver, really. No. So should we judge this in contemporary eyes or modern eyes, or should we meld the two? We don't need to judge it, okay? But what I do think is important is to remember that the Vikings were all of these things. They were settlers, they were raiders, they were murderers, they were rapists, they were thieves, okay? Other people were as well, but that's not an excuse, or it's not. It's just really it's contextual, isn't it? Okay, so there we go. It's the word context. Yes, indeed, they were a product of their time, but were they worse? Well, I think there's an interesting question. I'll just read a little passage. That's why I've been holding this book all the time. So this is called The Vikings and Their Origins by David M. Wilson. Okay. Now, I don't know whether this is viewed as a good book, an out-of-date book. It's not. It's a fairly old book, I think. But here is something written by an Irish writer. Thought it'd be a bit different than a typical Anglo-Saxon source. An Irish writer. Obviously, this is translated into modern English, of the 12th century. So this is a memory back. This is going back 100 years, so this is at least 100 years. So this is stories that grandfather and great-grandfather or great-grandmother passed down, essentially put into oral tradition, into memory, and was written down. So it says, in a word, although there were 100 hard-steeled iron heads on one neck, and 100 sharp, ready, cool, never-rusting brazen tongues in each head, and 100 garrulous, loud, unceasing voices from each tongue, they could not recount or narrate, enumerate or tell what all the Irish suffered in common, both men and women, laity and clergy, old and young, noble and ignoble, of hardships and of injuring and of oppression in every house from those valiant, wrathful, purely pagan people. So this is a 12th century description of the times when Ireland suffered from Viking raids. So we're looking mostly at the 10th century, I think, 10th and 11th century. And, you know, this is a story that that's the sort of description that people would later use about how William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy, how he treated, for example, the north of England, the harrying of the north. We read in very similar terms if we match how the Viking raids are described in the 12th century to how William's treatment of the Northern English is described, or indeed people in other areas as well. It's kind of similar. And did those people suffer? Yes. And I don't think we should belittle that or negate that just because that was a bit more normal in those times than it is for modern Westerners or people living in Northern Europe. We shouldn't reduce the things that the Vikings did in order to get slaves and precious metals and other commodities that they wanted. They were absolutely brutal raiders. Were there other brutal raiders at that time? Yes. But I do think that by and large there was a degree of fraternity within Christian Europe, within the Christian lands. There was an acceptance to a degree of right and wrong, and if a ruler overstepped their mark too far, they were ostracised by the rest of society. The problem with Scandinavia was, until it converted to Christianity, it wasn't part of a rest of society. So if we look at the modern world, where you know, the United Nations and NATO and the EU and all of these other structures exist, If a country that is within that sphere of that fraternity misbehaves, it gets embargoes and other penalties put on it. That means that it usually pulls itself back into line in some way, or just it never gets to the point of doing those unspoken things because it knows that it's not worth it because everyone else will ostracize you. But the Vikings existed outside of that. Scandinavia, of course, traded with the rest of Europe, but it was still pagan lands, and that's why the word pagan is mentioned there, because there was a belief at the time that not only were these people without God, they were unsaved, they hadn't converted, but equally they therefore weren't part of the structures and the fraternity that was starting to embed in Europe and bring about peace in some places where formerly there may have been war. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there, but it's just a few things to think about. I think when we're talking about the Vikings, we shouldn't over-glorify. I understand the urge when you're telling a story. This brutal, charismatic raider is a very glamorous character. So maybe have a think about what would be the equivalent of the Vikings in the modern world. I don't even really know if there is an exact comparison that we can make with any culture in the modern world, but they were nevertheless a people who were very, very opportunistic and aggressive in a way that I think it's fair, even judging them within their own time, to still accept that they were outside of the norm. They were outside of what we would normally judge to be the normal sets of morals of warfare and of sort of international relations, if you want to put it in those terms, of the time. The Vikings were outside of that, and they played by their own rules until essentially it became, probably we can say, economically more of a disadvantage to keep acting like that than it was an economic advantage. And I think we can probably say that by the 11th century, Europe had started to become a type of entity whereby all the countries were bound together through marriage of aristocracy and common respect of the papacy and these various other things. I don't think it's any coincidence that we see the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, and it's also the 11th century when we see the Viking era really come to an end, with a couple of tiny exceptions. But generally speaking, the Viking era petered out in the 11th century, and then in the 11th century we see nations starting to form into more solid entities that are interlinked by marriage more firmly, and then we see the papacy having so much control over Europe that by the end of the 11th century they can inspire people enough to go to war hundreds of miles away against the Muslims in a way that never could have happened, I don't believe, before the 11th century. So some things to think about there, and I would just my parting thought would be the Vikings, yep, okay, they're not like the Victorian idea of Vikings, but equally they're probably really, if we're honest with ourselves, not like the 1990s vision of Vikings either. They were an aggressive, opportunistic, raiding culture that have come down to us through the centuries as being something very specific and something to be feared, but also something to be remembered and spoken and written about, and still attract a lot of attention from historians today. I hope that was something interesting and maybe gives you some new ways to think about this period and this topic. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.